Hey there, it's Shawna Kugler, Office Manager with Easy Choice Realty. I just real quick wanted to do a brief training on how to fill out a listing contract. The form I'm going to go ahead and go over with you today is one of the more commonly used forms. It's the Florida Association of Realtors, the FAR form of the Exclusive Right of Sale Listing Agreement. Obviously, as a listing agent, there's several different types of listing contracts you can use depending on what type of listing you're getting, whether it's a full traditional service or if it's a non-rep listing, whatever type it is. You can download listing contracts directly from Transaction Desk or Form Simplicity. But again, I wanted to just do a quick training, so I'm going to use this form as it's probably the most common one, and many of the topics that are discussed in this contract will carry over into other listing contracts. So again, you might want to go ahead and pull this up so you can be reviewing it as I'm going over it, but this is the Florida Association of Realtors Exclusive Right of Sale Listing Agreement. Okay, so let's go ahead and go over the contract. Understand that when you download these contracts, it's pretty much fill in the blank. There's always going to be a spot for additional terms where you can add it or edit a contract, based off whatever negotiations you have done. But in general, you're going to be filling in the blanks. And again, as I'm going through this, I'm going to kind of explain to you how I've done it in the past, but you have the flexibility of being able to do it however it's comfortable for you and your sellers. The first part is just basically talking about who the seller and the broker are. Please understand that when there are multiple owners of the property, every owner must sign the listing contract. Okay? And yes, you will be the authorized associate for the listing, but all contracts will be assigned to the broker, which would be Easy Choice Realty. Section 1 is just talking about the start and expiration of the listing. Understand that the MLS does require you to enter in a start date and an expiration date. Typically, it used to be 6 months was kind of an average. I have been seeing a lot of contracts now, especially if they're short sale contracts going for a 1-year period. But again, it's going to be completely up to you. A seller can always extend the listing contract with you as you're coming up to the expiration date. So just because you have a 6-month expiration or a 12-month expiration doesn't mean that you can't extend that further as you get closer. But the MLS does require that you have a start date and an expiration date for all listing contracts. Section 2 is talking about the property. Lines 13 and 14 are asking you to fill in the full property address, including the street, city, state, and zip code. The legal description, you can pull this directly from the tax records of the property. The personal property, including appliances. Please understand that it is customary that anything that is attached to a property will be included in the sale. If there is something specific that the seller does not want to leave, you have to make sure that that's disclosed to the buyer. So this is a section where you would list all the appliances that they're leaving with the property. If they want to, again, take anything with them, please make sure that it's noted in the listing contract that certain things don't convey. Things you might want to ask them about would be ceiling fans, light fixtures, window treatments. If there's anything that's attached to the property, as such as cabinets or shelving, you want to make sure that you've gone over that with them so there's no surprises as you're getting to the closing. Because again, if it's not excluded from the contract, the buyer will assume it stays. The next one, line C, is occupancy. You have to disclose whether or not the property is currently occupied by a tenant. And if so, you also have to disclose when that lease expires. Okay, section 3. This talks about the pricing terms of the contract. Understand that everything can be edited after a listing, but you have to have your starting point. So line 22, A says price. There's a blank. You just fill in the start price of the property. B is financing terms. You have to check the boxes, whether it will do cash, conventional, FHA, VA, or other. Pretty much every property can do cash or conventional. There will be certain guidelines to whether or not the property can have VA or FHA buyers. And those guidelines would be price. You might want to just check to find out what the price limits are for VA or FHA. Condition of the property. Not every property will pass an FHA inspection. And also, if the property is in a condo or townhome community, you have to verify that the association will allow somebody to go with an FHA buyer. The next section is the seller financing. This is going to be line 24. If the seller is willing to do seller financing, you must check that box. If they don't check that box, you can't advertise seller financing in the MLS. Line 25 6 is assumption of existing mortgage. This is not something that's very common, but if the seller has an assumable mortgage, you check that box and fill out the terms of the assumable mortgage. But again, this is not a common trait. And then C, seller expenses. If the seller is offering to pay closing costs for the buyer, this is where you would fill that in. But again, this is something that's normally negotiated upon buyer presenting an offer. It's not something that's typically done at the listing contract. But if the seller says to you that they would like to go ahead and offer points or a percentage to the buyer, then you can fill it in right here. Okay, section 4. This is talking about broker obligations. Understand that you don't really fill out anything here. This is just basically disclosing that you're going to place the property in the MLS. If you're allowed, you'll put up a for sale sign. I do want to point out line 40 and 41. Do not have your seller check those boxes unless they don't want you to advertise their property on the internet. Okay, understand that that is an opt-out clause. Also, line 52. If you're planning on using a lockbox to allow realtors to gain access to the property, you must check that box so it's disclosed to the seller that you're using a lockbox. And then at the bottom of every page, there's going to be a spot for you as the listing agent and the seller to initial. So line 53, they would want to initial that. And then section 4 carries on to the next page. If you're going to withhold offers, basically any offer that's presented, even if you feel that it's a lowball offer, you must basically give that to your seller and at least tell them about it. If the seller wants you to withhold offers, you must check the 2 boxes on line 56. The next section is basically, again, it's talking about the fact that their property is going to be displayed on the internet, that it's going to be advertised on the internet. Your best interest and your best chances of selling the property, don't have your seller opt out of any of those clauses, because then you're limited to what websites you can advertise their property on. Section 5, seller obligations. Again, seller obligations will be to allow you to gain access to the property, provide you with a key, and you want to read all of this, but this allows them to disclose to you if there's any building code violations or special assessments on the property. But again, read all these so that you know exactly what the disclosures are for you and the seller. But it's just basically your right to list the property and for the seller to basically allow you to try to sell the property. Section 6 talks about compensation. This is a very important part of the listing contract, and unfortunately this is the part where most agents make mistakes because of the way that they break it down for you. So I want you to please pay attention, because if there's errors here, then it could jeopardize the commission that's brought in at the closing and in essence jeopardize how much money you take home after the closing. So I want to point out that there's 2 different sections here. One talks about what the seller is obligated to pay. And then the second part talks about what we as a broker are willing to pay a buyer's agent. So the first part, basically line 89 here, talks about the seller is paying the broker what dollar amount or percentage that you've negotiated with them. So please understand that on line 89 here, this is the total commission due from the seller. For example, if you take a 6% commission, you are going to keep 3% and offer 3% of that to an agent that brings the buyer. This line needs to show that full 6%, okay, because that's what the seller is going to be obligated for. The common mistake that people do is they put their commission here, and then they put their buyer's agent commission of 3% in the next section, which I'll talk about in a second. Unfortunately, that's only putting the seller on the hook for 3%. So in essence, you'd be working for free at that point. So please make sure that the total commission due from the seller is on line 89. That can be a percentage, or there's also a line there if you negotiate a flat dollar amount, say $5,000 or $10,000. So whether it's a flat dollar amount or a percentage, please make sure that it's on line 89, the total due from the seller. Now, parts B and C of that, if you pre-negotiate a lease fee or an option fee, which again is not something that's very common, but if you pre-negotiate something other than a sale commission, you'd want to fill that in on B or C. But again, not as common or as important as line A, because that's going to be your commission upon a sale. The next section does talk about, I want you to look at line 100. This is your protection period. I would like you to read that paragraph because it explains when your commission is due. One thing that you're protected is if you procure a buyer and the seller cancels this contract with you, you need to fill in how many days you're protected. Very commonly, I used to do 60. So if I procured a buyer, then I would be protected from that seller canceling their contract with me and approaching that buyer for 60 days. If a seller cancels a contract with you and approaches your buyer, let's just assume you put 60 there, then you would still be entitled to your commission if they sell to that buyer during that protection period. So again, you want to fill that in 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, whatever you negotiate with your seller. And then Section E talks about retained deposits. This is if you are able to help your seller get a deposit, a buyer cancels a contract. You want to put what percentage of that deposit you'll get. So if they bring in, a $1,500 escrow deposit, you want 50% of that as like to compensate you for the time that you put in to help them to get that deposit. You want to make sure that there's 50% written there. So again, this is a negotiable item. You can do 25%, 50%, whatever it might be. Okay.